The Pearl, Chapter 3. A town is a thing like a colonial animal. A town has a nervous system, and a head, and shoulders, and feet. A town is a thing separate from all other towns, so that there are no two towns alike. And a town has a whole emotion. How news travels through a town is a mystery, not easily to be solved. News seems to move faster than small boys can scramble and dart to tell it, faster than women can call it over the fences. Before Kino and Juana and the other fishers had come to Kino's brush house, the nerves of the town were pulsing and vibrating with the news. Kino had found the pearl of the world. Before panting little boys could strangle out the words, their mothers knew it. The news swept on past the brush houses, and it washed in a foaming wave into the town of stone and plaster. It came to the priest walking in his garden, and it put a thoughtful look in his eyes, and a memory of certain repairs necessary to the church. He wondered what the pearl would be worth. And he wondered whether he had baptized Kino's baby, or married him for that matter. The news came to the shopkeepers, and they looked at men's clothes that had not sold so well. The news came to the doctor, where he sat with a woman whose illness was age, though neither she nor the doctor would admit it. And when it was made plain who Kino was, the doctor grew stern and judicious at the same time. "He is a client of mine," the doctor said. "I am treating his child for a scorpion sting." And the doctor's eyes rolled up a little in their fat hammocks, and he thought of Paris. He remembered the room he had lived in there as a great and luxurious place, and he remembered the hard-faced woman who had lived with him as a beautiful and kind girl, although she had been none of these three. The doctor looked past his aged patient and saw himself sitting in a restaurant in Paris, and a waiter was just opening a bottle of wine. The news came early to the beggars in front of the church, and it made them giggle a little with pleasure, for they knew that there is no almsgiver in the world like a poor man who is suddenly lucky. Kino had found the pearl of the world. In the town, in little offices, sat the men who bought pearls from the fishers. They waited in their chairs until the pearls came in, and then they cackled and fought and shouted and threatened until they reached the lowest price the fisherman would stand. But there was a price below which they dared not go, for it had happened that a fisherman in despair had given his pearls to the church. And when the buying was over, these buyers sat alone, and their fingers played restlessly with the pearls, and they wished they owned the pearls. For there were not many buyers, really. There was only one. And he kept these agents in separate offices to give a semblance of competition. The news came to these men, and their eyes squinted and their fingertips burned a little, and each one thought of how the patron could not live forever, and someone had to take his place. And each one thought how with some capital he could get a new start. All manner of people grew interested in Kino, people with things to sell, and people with favors to ask. Kino had found the pearl of the world. The essence of pearl mixed with the essence of men, and a curious dark residue was precipitated. Every man suddenly became related to Kino's pearl, and Kino's pearl went into the dreams, the speculations, the schemes, the plans, the futures, the wishes, the needs, the lusts, the hungers of everyone, and only one person stood in the way, and that was Kino, so that he became curiously every man's enemy. The news stirred up something infinitely black and evil in the town. The black distillate was like the scorpion, or like hunger in the smell of food, or like loneliness when love is withheld. The poison sects of the town began to manufacture venom, and the town swelled and puffed with the pressure of it. But Kino and Juana did not know these things. Because they were happy and excited, they thought everyone shared their joy. Juan Tomas and Apollonia did, and they were the world too. In the afternoon, when the sun had gone over the mountains of the peninsula to sink in the outward sea, Kino squatted in his house with Juana beside him. And the brush house was crowded with neighbors. Kino held the great pearl in his hand, and it was warm and alive in his hand. And the music of the pearl had merged with the music of the family, so that one beautified the other. The neighbors looked at the pearl in Kino's hand, and they wondered how such luck could come to any man. And Juan Tomas, who squatted on Kino's right hand because he was his brother, asked, "What will you do, now that you have become a rich man?" Kino looked into his pearl, and Juana cast her eyelashes down and arranged her shawl to cover her face so that her excitement could not be seen. And in the incandescence of the pearl the pictures formed of the things Kino's mind had considered in the past and had given up as impossible. In the pearl he saw Juana and Coyotito and himself standing and kneeling at the high altar, and they were being married now that they could pay. He spoke softly. "We will be married in the church." In the pearl he saw how they were dressed, Juana in a shawl stiff with newness and a new skirt, and from under the long skirt Kino could see that she wore shoes. It was in the pearl, the picture glowing there. He himself was dressed in new white clothes, and he carried a new hat, not of straw but of fine black felt, and he too wore shoes, not sandals, but shoes that laced. But Coyotito, he was the one. He wore a blue sailor suit from the United States and a little yachting cap such as Kino had seen once when a pleasure boat put into the estuary. All of these things Kino saw on the lucent pearl, and he said, "We will have new clothes." And the music of the pearl rose like a chorus of trumpets in his ears. Then to the lovely gray surface of the pearl came the little things Kino wanted. A harpoon to take the place of one lost a year ago. A new harpoon of iron with a ring in the end of the shaft, and, his mind could hardly make the leap, a rifle. But why not, since he was so rich? And Kino saw Kino in the pearl. Kino holding a Winchester carbine. It was the wildest daydreaming and very pleasant. His lips moved hesitantly over this. "A rifle," he said. "Perhaps a rifle." It was the rifle that broke down the barriers. This was an impossibility, and if he could think of having a rifle, whole horizons were burst and he could rush on. For it is said that humans are never satisfied, that you give them one thing and they want something more. And this is said in disparagement, whereas it is one of the greatest talents the species has, and one that has made it superior to animals that are satisfied with what they have. The neighbors, close pressed and silent in the house, nodded their heads at his wild imaginings. And a man in the rear murmured, "A rifle. He will have a rifle." But the music of the pearl was shrilling with triumph in Kino. Juana looked up and her eyes were wide at Kino's courage and at his imagination. An electric strength had come to him now. The horizons were kicked out. In the pearl he saw Coyotito sitting at a little desk in a school, just as Kino had once seen it through an open door. And Coyotito was dressed in a jacket, and he had on a white collar and a broad silken tie. Moreover, Coyotito was writing on a big piece of paper. Kino looked at his neighbors fiercely. "My son will go to school," he said, and the neighbors were hushed. Juana caught her breath sharply. Her eyes were bright as she watched him, and she looked quickly down at Coyotito in her arms to see whether this might be possible. But Kino's face shone with prophecy. "My son will read and open the books, and my son will write and will know writing, and my son will make numbers, and these things will make us free, because he will know. He will know, and through him we will know." And in the pearl Kino saw himself and Juana squatting by the little fire in the brush hut, while Coyotito read from a great book. "This is what the pearl will do," said Kino. And he had never said so many words together in his life. And suddenly he was afraid of his talking. His hand closed down over the pearl and cut the light away from it. Kino was afraid as a man is afraid who says, "I will," without knowing. Now the neighbors knew they had witnessed a great marvel. They knew that the time would now date from Kino's pearl, and that they would discuss this moment for many years to come. If these things came to pass, they would recount how Kino looked and what he said and how his eyes shone, and they would say, "He was a man transfigured. Some power was given to him, and therein it started. You see what a great man he has become, starting from that moment." and I myself saw it. And if Kino's planning came to nothing, those same neighbors would say, there it started. A foolish madness came over him so that he spoke foolish words. God keep us from such things. Yes, God punished Kino because he rebelled against the way things are. You see what has become of him, and I myself saw the moment when his reason left him. Kino looked down at his closed hand, and the knuckles were scabbed over and tight where he had struck the gate. Now the dusk was coming, and Juana looped her shawl under the baby so that he hung against her hip, and she went to the fire hole and dug a coal from the ashes and broke a few twigs over it and fanned a flame alive. The little flames danced on the faces of the neighbors. They knew they should go to their own dinners, but they were reluctant to leave. The dark was almost in, and Juana's fire threw shadows on the brush walls when the whisper came in, passed from mouth to mouth. The father is coming. The priest is coming. The men uncovered their heads and stepped back from the door, and the women gathered their shawls about their faces and cast down their eyes. Kino and Juan Tomas's brother stood up. The priest came in, a graying, aging man with old skin and a young, sharp eye. Children, he considered these people, and he treated them like children. Kino, he said softly, thou art named after a great man and a great father of the church. He made it sound like a benediction. Thy namesake tamed the desert and sweetened the minds of thy people. Didst thou know that? It is in the books. Kino looked quickly down at Coyotito's head, where he hung on Juana's hip. Someday, his mind said, that boy would know what things were in the books and what things were not. The music had gone out of Kino's head, but now, thinly, slowly, the melody of the morning, the music of evil, of the enemy sounded, but it was faint and weak. And Kino looked at his neighbors to see who might have brought this song in. But the priest was speaking again. It has come to me that thou hast found a great fortune, a great pearl. Kino opened his hand and held it out, and the priest gasped a little at the size and the beauty of the pearl. And then he said, I hope thou wilt remember to give thanks, my son, to him who has given thee this treasure, and to pray for guidance in the future. Kino nodded dumbly, and it was Juana who spoke softly. We will, father, and we will be married now. Kino has said so. She looked at the neighbors for the confirmation, and they nodded their heads solemnly. The priest said, It is pleasant to see that your first thoughts are good thoughts. God bless you, my children. He turned and left quickly, and the people let him through. But Kino's hand had closed tightly on the pearl again, and he was glancing about suspiciously, for the evil song was in his ears, shrilling against the music of the pearl. The neighbors slipped away to go to their houses, and Juana squatted by the fire and set her clay pot of boiled beans over the little flame. Kino stepped to the doorway and looked out. As always, he could smell the smoke from many fires, and he could see the hazy stars and feel the damp of the night air, so that he covered his nose from it. The thin dog came to him and threshed itself in greeting like a wind-blown flag, and Kino looked down at it and didn't see it. He had broken through the horizons into a cold and lonely outside. He felt alone and unprotected, and scrapping crickets and shrilling tree frogs and croaking toads seemed to be carrying the melody of evil. Kino shivered a little and drew his blanket more tightly against his nose. He carried the pearl still in his hand, tightly closed in his palm, and it was warm and smooth against his skin. Behind him he heard Juana patting the cakes before she put them down on the clay cooking sheet. Kino felt all the warmth and security of his family behind him, and the song of the family came from behind him like the purring of a kitten. But now, by saying what his future was going to be like, he had created it. A plan is a real thing, and things projected are experienced. A plan once made and visualized becomes a reality along with other realities, never to be destroyed, but easily to be attacked. Thus Kino's future was real, but having set it up, other forces were set up to destroy it, and this he knew, so that he had to prepare to meet the attack. And this Kino also knew, that the gods do not love men's plans, and the gods do not love success unless it comes by accident. He He knew that the gods take their revenge on a man if he be successful through his own efforts. Consequently, Kino was afraid of plants, but having made one, he could never destroy it. And to meet the attack, Kino was already making a hard skin for himself against the world. His eyes and his mind probed for danger before it appeared. Standing in the door, he saw 2 men approach, and one of them carried a lantern which lighted the ground and the legs of the men. They turned in through the opening of Kino's brush fence and came to his door. And Kino saw that one was the doctor, and the other the servant who had opened the gate in the morning. The split knuckles on Kino's right hand burned when he saw who they were. The doctor said, "I was not in when you came this morning, but now, at the first chance, I have come to see the baby." Kino stood in the door, filling it, and hatred raged and flamed in back of his eyes, and fear too, for the hundreds of years of subjugation were cut deep in him. "The baby is nearly well now," he said curtly. The doctor smiled, but his eyes in their little limp-lined hammocks did not smile. He said, "Sometimes, my friend, the scorpion sting has a curious effect. There will be apparent improvement, and then without warning, poof!" He pursed his lips and made a little expression to show how quick it could be, and he shifted his small black doctor's bag about so that the light of the lamp fell upon it, for he knew that Kino's race loved the tools of any craft and trust them. "Sometimes," the doctor went on in liquid tone, "sometimes there will be a withered leg, or a blind eye, or a crumpled back. Oh, I know the sting of the scorpion, my friend, and I can cure it." Kino felt the rage and hatred melting toward fear. He did not know, and perhaps this doctor did, and he could not take the chance of pitting his certain ignorance against this man's possible knowledge. He was trapped as his people were always trapped, and would be until, as he had said, they could be sure that the things in the books were really in the books. He could not take a chance, not with the life or with the straightness of Coyotito. He stood aside and let the doctor and his man enter the brush hut. Juana stood up from the fire and backed away as he entered, and she covered the baby's face with the fringe of her shawl. And when the doctor went to her and held out his hand, she clutched the baby tight and looked at Kino where he stood, with the fire shadows leaping on his face. Kino nodded, and only then did she let the doctor take the baby. "Hold the light," the doctor said, and when the servant held the lantern high, the doctor looked for a moment at the wound on the baby's shoulder. He was thoughtful for a moment, and then he rolled back the baby's eyelid and looked at the eyeball. He nodded his head, while Coyotito struggled against him. "It is as I thought," he said. "The poison has gone inward, and it will strike soon. Come look." He held the eyelid down. "See, it is blue." And Kino, looking anxiously, saw that indeed it was a little blue, and he didn't know whether or not it was always a little blue. But the trap was set. He couldn't take the chance. The doctor's eyes watered in their little hammocks. "I will give him something to try and turn the poison aside," he said, and he handed the baby to Kino. Then from his bag he took a little bottle of white powder and a capsule of gelatin. He filled the capsule with the powder and closed it, and then around the first capsule he fitted a second capsule and closed it. Then he worked very deftly. He took the baby and pinched its lower lip until it opened its mouth. His fat fingers placed the capsule far back on the baby's tongue, back of the point where he could spit it out, and then from the floor he picked up the little pitcher of pulque and gave Coyotito a drink, and it was done. He looked again at the baby's eyeball, and he pursed his lips and seemed to think. At last he handed the baby back to Juana, and he turned to Kino. "I think the poison will attack within the hour," he said. "The medicine may save the baby from hurt, but I will come back in an hour. Perhaps I am in time to save him." He took a deep breath and went out of the hut, and his servant followed him with the lantern. Now Juana had the baby under her shawl, and she stared at it with anxiety and fear. Kino came to her, and he lifted the shawl and stared at the baby. He moved his hand to look under the eyelid, and only then saw that the pearl was still in his hand. Then he went to a box by the wall, and from it he brought a piece of rag. He wrapped the pearl in the rag, then he went to the corner of the brush house, and dug a little hole with his fingers in the dirt floor, and he put the pearl in the hole, and covered it up, and concealed the place. and then he went to the fire where Juana was squatting, watching the baby's face. The doctor, back at his house, settled into his chair and looked at his watch. His people brought him a little supper of chocolate and sweet cakes and fruit, and he stared at the food discontentedly. In the houses of the neighbors, the subject that would lead all conversations for a long time to come was aired for the first time to see how it would go. The neighbors showed one another with their thumbs how big the pearl was, and they made little caressing gestures to show how lovely it was. From now on, they would watch Kino and Juana very closely to see whether riches turned in their head, as riches turn all people's heads. Everyone knew why the doctor had come. He was not good at dissembling, and he was very well understood. Out in the estuary, a tight-woven school of small fishes glittered and broke water to escape a school of great fishes that drove in to eat them. And in the houses the people could hear the swish of the small ones and the bouncing splash of the great ones as the slaughter went on. The dampness arose out of the gulf, and it was deposited on brushes and cacti and on little trees and salty drops. And the night mice crept about on the ground, and the little night hawks hunted them silently. The skinny black puppy with the flame spots over his eyes came to Kino's door and looked in. He nearly shook his hindquarters loose when Kino glanced up at him, and he subsided when Kino looked away. The puppy did not enter the house, but he watched with frantic interest while Kino ate his beans from the little pottery dish, and wiped it clean with a corn cake, and ate the cake, and washed the whole down with a drink of pulque. Kino was finished and was rolling a cigarette when Juana spoke sharply. "Kino?" He glanced at her and then got up and went quickly to her, for he saw fright in her eyes. He stood over her, looking down, but the light was very dim. He kicked a pile of twigs into the fire to make a blaze, and then he could see the face of Coyotito. The baby's face was flushed, and his throat was working. A little thick drool of saliva issued from his lips. The spasm of the stomach muscles began, and the baby was very sick. Kino knelt beside his wife. "So the doctor knew," he said, but he said it for himself as well as for his wife, for his mind was hard and suspicious, and he was remembering the white powder. Juana rocked from side to side and moaned out a little song of the family, as though it could ward off the danger, and the baby vomited and writhed in her arms. Now uncertainty was in Kino, and the music of evil throbbed in his head and nearly drove out Juana's song. The doctor finished his chocolate and nibbled the little fallen pieces of sweet cake. He brushed his fingers on a napkin, looked at his watch, arose, and took up his little bag. The news of the baby's illness traveled quickly among the brush houses, for sickness is second only to hunger as the enemy of poor people. And some said softly, "Luck, you see, brings bitter friends," and they nodded and got up to go to Kino's house. The neighbors scuttled with covered noses through the dark until they crowded into Kino's house again. They stood and gazed, and they made little comments on the sadness that this should happen at a time of joy, and they said, "All things are in God's hands." The old women squatted down beside Juana to try to give her aid if they could, and comfort if they could not. The doctor hurried in, followed by his man. He scattered the old women like chickens. He took the baby and examined it, and he felt its head. "The poison, it has worked," he said. "I think I can defeat it. I will try my best." He asked for water, and in the cup of it he put 3 drops of ammonia, and he pried open the baby's mouth and poured it down. The baby sputtered and screeched under the treatment, and Juana watched him with haunted eyes. The doctor spoke a little as he worked. "It is lucky that I know about the poison of the scorpion. Otherwise—" and he shrugged to show what could have happened. But Kino was suspicious, and he could not take his eyes from the doctor's open bag and from the bottle of white powder there. Gradually the spasm subsided, and the baby relaxed under the doctor's hands. And then Coyotito sighed deeply and went to sleep, for he was very tired with vomiting. The doctor put the baby in Juana's arms. "He will get well now," he said. "I have won the fight." And Juana looked at him with adoration. The doctor was closing his bag now. He said, "When do you think you can pay this bill?" He said it even kindly. "When I have sold my pearl, I will pay you," Kino said. "You have a pearl? A good pearl?" the doctor asked with interest. And then the chorus of the neighbors broke in. "He has found the pearl of the world," they cried, and they joined forefinger with thumb to show how great the pearl was. "Kino will be a rich man," they clamored. "It is a pearl such as one has never seen." The doctor looked surprised. "I had not heard of it. Do you keep this pearl in a safe place? Perhaps you would like me to put it in my safe." Kino's eyes were hooded now. His cheeks were drawn taut. "I have it secure," he said. "Tomorrow I will sell it, and then I will pay you." The doctor shrugged, and his wet eyes never left Kino's eyes. He knew the pearl would be buried in the house, and he thought Kino might look toward the place where it was buried. "It would be a shame to have it stolen before you could sell it," the doctor said, and he saw Kino's eyes flick involuntarily to the floor near the side post of the brush house. When the doctor had gone and all the neighbors had reluctantly returned to their houses, Kino squatted beside the little glowing coals in the fire hole and listened to the night sound, the soft sweep of the little waves on the shore and the distant barking of dogs, the creeping of the breeze through the brush house roof, and the soft speech of his neighbors in their houses in the village. For these people do not sleep soundly all night. They awake at intervals and talk a little and then go to sleep again. And after a while Kino got up and went to the door of his house. He smelled the breeze, and he listened for any foreign sound of secrecy or creeping, and his eyes searched the darkness, for the music of evil was sounding in his head, and he was fierce and afraid. After he had probed the night with his senses, he went to the place by the side post where the pearl was buried, and he dug it up and brought it to his sleeping mat. And under his sleeping mat he dug another little hole in the dirt floor and buried the pearl and covered it up again. And Juana, sitting by the fire hole, watched him with questioning eyes, and when he had buried his pearl, she asked, "Who do you fear?" Kino searched for a true answer, and at last he said, "Everyone," and he could feel a shell of hardness drawing over him. After a while they lay down together on the sleeping mat, and Juana did not put the baby in his box tonight, but cradled him in her arms and covered his face with her head shawl, and the last light went out of the embers in the fire hole. But Kino's brain burned, even during his sleep, and he dreamed that Coyotito could read, that one of his own people could tell him the truth of things. And in his dream, Coyotito was reading from a book as large as a house, with letters as big as dogs, and the words galloped and played on the book. And then darkness spread over the page, and with the darkness came the music of evil again, and Kino stirred in his sleep, and when he stirred, Juana's eyes opened in the darkness. And then Kino awakened, with the evil music pulsing in him, and he lay in the darkness with his ears alert. Then from the corner of the house came a sound so soft that it might have been simply a thought, a little furtive movement, a touch of a foot on earth, the almost inaudible purr of controlled breathing. Kino held his breath to listen, and he knew that whatever dark thing was in his house was holding its breath too, to listen. For a time no sound at all came from the corner of the brush house. Then Kino might have thought he had imagined the sound. But Juana's hand came creeping over to him in a warning. And then the sound came again, the whisper of a foot on dry earth and the scratch of fingers in the soil. And now a wild fear surged in Kino's breast, and on the fear came rage, as it always did. Kino's hand crept into his breast where his knife hung on a string, and then he sprang like an angry cat, leaped, striking and spitting for the dark thing he knew was in the corner of the house. He felt cloth, struck at it with his knife and missed, and struck again and felt his knife go through the cloth, and then his head crashed with lightning and exploded with pain. There was a soft scurry in the doorway and running steps for a moment, and then silence. Kino could feel warm blood running from his forehead, and he could hear Juana calling to him, "Kino, Kino." And there was terror in her voice. The coldness came over him as quickly as the rage had, and he said, "I am all right. The thing has gone." He groped his way back to the sleeping mat. Already Juana was working at the fire. She uncovered an ember from the ashes and shredded little pieces of corn husk over it and blew a little flame into the corn husks so that a tiny light danced through the hut. And then from a secret place in the hut, Juana brought a little piece of consecrated candle and lighted it at the flame and set it upright on a fireplace stone. She worked quickly, crooning as she moved about. She dipped the end of her head shawl in water and swabbed the blood from Kino's bruised forehead. "It is nothing." Kino said, but his eyes and his voice were hard and cold, and a brooding hate was growing in him. Now the tension which had been growing in Juana boiled up to the surface, and her lips were thin. "This thing is evil," she cried harshly. "This pearl is like a sin. It will destroy us." And her voice rose shrilly. "Throw it away, Kino. Let us break it between stones. Let us bury it and forget the place. Let us throw it back into the sea. It has brought evil. Kino, my husband, it will destroy us." And in the firelight her lips and her eyes were alive with her fear. But Kino's face was set, and his mind and his will were set. "This is our one chance," he said. "Our son must go to school. He must break out of the pot that holds us in." "It will destroy us all," Juana cried. "Even our son." "Hush," Kino said. "Do not speak any more. In the morning we will sell the pearl, and then the evil will be gone, and only the good remain. Now hush, my wife." His dark eyes scowled into the little fire, and for the first time he knew that his knife was still in his hands, and he raised the blade and looked at it and saw a little line of blood on the steel. For a moment he seemed about to wipe the blade on his trousers, but then he plunged the knife into the earth and so cleansed it. The distant roosters began to crow, and the air changed, and the dawn was coming. The wind of the morning ruffled the water of the estuary and whispered through the mangroves, and the little waves beat on the rubbly beach with an increased tempo. Kino raised the sleeping mat and dug up the pearl and put it in front of him and stared at it. And the beauty of the pearl, winking and glimmering in the light of the little candle, cozened his brain with its beauty. So lovely it was, so soft, and its own music came from it, its music of promise and delight, its guarantee of the future, of comfort, of security. Its warm lucence promised a poultice against illness and a wall against insult. It closed a door on hunger, and as he stared at it, Kino's eyes softened and his face relaxed. He could see the little image of the consecrated candle reflected in the soft surface of the pearl. And he heard again in his ears the lovely music of the undersea, the tone of the diffused green light of the sea bottom. Juana, glancing secretly at him, saw him smile. And because they were in some way one thing and one purpose, she smiled with him. And they began this day with hope.